The berserkers hardly noticed injuries in the fight, regardless of whether through fire or steel. After a specially brewed potion, which gives the berserker a rush-like condition, the berserker destroys everything that gets in his way. The word berserk or berserk comes from the Old Norse Germanic language, and meaning roughly the one who has turned into a bear or the one who wears a bearskin. Why exactly did the berserkers choose the bear as their crest? Some researchers even claim that the word berserker is coming by an Old Norse bear cult, or one order, of beermen in Scandinavia. This cult or these orders called themselves the Sons of Odin, the chief god of the Vikings. What is this cult all about? Were the berserkers just madmen, or this cult gave you special strategic and physical advantages? We will answer these questions in this video. Today I will tell you the story about the berserker as the second part of the berserker video series. Here we go. The berserkers could come from a cult of shamanism, escaped during a bear hunt. That means, a Viking who wanted to become a berserker, first had to hunt down a full-grown bear, all by himself. According to the Old Norse legends, berserkers mostly, but not always, were sons of jarls and wealthy Vikings. These were their bodyguards, as long as their father was in power. Some researchers now assume that the berserkers have secluded themselves in Viking society. This means that even for the Vikings, the berserkers were too wild, too brutal, and too psychopathic. For this reason, the Vikings always kept their distance from the berserkers on raids, not to get in their way. This went so far, in part, that the berserkers had their own ships from crossing Scandinavia to the raid locations in Europe. In addition, the berserker became more and more common in the Viking world, as contract killers and bodyguards hired. So that their special status, which was often a negative special status, only increased. The berserkers distanced themselves more and more from Viking society. The berserkers were very well paid for their services as bodyguards, or assassins. Many Vikings valued the combat experience of the berserkers, but at the same time, one could say, abhorred them. Although the berserkers had a very good reputation as warriors among the Vikings, did the normal Viking warriors know that the berserkers were either sick or were under the influence of drugs? This was one of the reasons to stay away from the berserkers. Taking the word berserker apart means serker in Old Norse Germanic shirt, or in this case fur or coat. And the word ber is an Old Norse Germanic word for bear. The first mention of berserkers was in the saga Grim-Drapa. This saga was written by the skald Tarn Bjorn, who lived in Norway in the 9th century. In addition, after the Viking Age, the saga Grim-Drapa was rewritten by the Icelandic writer Snorri Sturluson, written down in Iceland after the Viking Age in the 13th century AD. This epic saga covers the conquests of Norway's King Harald I Fairhair. The first explicit mention of the berserkers in this saga takes place in the Battle of Hafrsfjord in 872 AD. Snorri Sturluson described in detail how the berserkers went mad, carried bear skins, and differed from the other Vikings. Quoted from the saga by Snorri Sturluson, the slayers had a power equal to that of a bear. They could not be killed by fire or steel. Quote end. Another description is the berserk of another font foundry equally interesting. This time describes the berserkers of the Roman font maker Tacitus, Publius Cornelius Tacitus, who lived from AD 58 to AD 120, and described the German tribes as backward and cruel, and people hardened by hunger and cold. Tacitus wrote in the 31st chapter of his report on Germania, that the Germans trained selected children to become berserkers from an early age. Juvenile berserks are not allowed to grow long hair until they come of age and grow a beard. After coming of age, The contenders had to finish off their first enemy. Only then are they allowed to tie their hair into a ponytail. Tacitus also described that the berserkers among the German tribes, the foremost troops in the battle, were which attempted breaches in the Roman slam lines. However, Tacitus did not use the word berserker in his report on Germania. He noted that these Germanic warriors were single-minded and ferocious. According to Tacitus, they had black shields, and their bodies were artistically painted. In his description, the berserkers always attacked the Romans in a flash. In the 12th century AD, with the completion of the Christianization of all of Scandinavia, find the cult around the berserkers in history to get lost. In 1122 AD, a law was enacted throughout Scandinavia which warned warriors to wear a bear skin and themselves by external stimulants, or even without into a wild and frenzied state of a berserker. The offense was punished with a 3-year ban. In the Norwegian rites drafted by the Church, the berserkers were no longer mentioned during this period. Everything indicated that this way of fighting at that time, albeit regionally variable, already beginning to disappear or had already disappeared. After that, 2 strands of tradition emerge. One calls particularly brave warriors berserkers, without attributing any special qualities to them. The other begins to stylize them into human beasts. What both strands have in common is that the authors had no personal view of berserkers and no living witnesses either, who had experienced berserkers themselves knew. The berserkers were only known from the sagas and legends passed down by word of mouth. The Grettis saga, written around in the year 1320 AD, belongs to the first line of tradition. It already considers particularly brave men to be berserkers. Because in contrast to all older reports, it keeps up with the description of the Battle of Hafrsfjord in 872 AD, and already the leader of Harold's opponents for a berserker, although berserkers never appear as leaders. The berserkers were the avant-garde troops in the Viking army. These were placed in the front line in a battle. The berserkers tore gaps in the enemy formation and left a few mountains of corpses behind. Then the regular Viking warriors came after them. In other sources, the berserkers were also considered a species-privileged elite unit described. If you sum up all the sagas and legends about the berserkers, it can be seen that all the sagas have more or less the same pattern about the berserkers to report that the animal-like warrior berserker is virtually impossible to defeat in battle. The weapon of the berserkers was sometimes thoughtlessness and freedom of spirit. The berserkers were very uninhibited in battle due to the external stimulants, and were not afraid. As a result, they had a quick reaction time and could quickly attack and dodge enemies. In the nervous system, practically all emotions have been suspended. The legend of the invincibility of the berserkers continued to reverberate for some time, even after the epoch of the Vikings was over. In the 11th and 12th centuries AD, when the Christianization of Scandinavia took place, the people who still lived like berserkers were considered successors and heirs. The fearless Vikings, found in many sagas and legends, in many sagas of Northern Europe, have immortalized. Standing in the way of a final explanation of the berserker is that the events of the berserkers were written at a time when there had been no berserkers for generations. So these are not direct eyewitness accounts, but narrative passed on from generation to generation, by hearing and saying. That's it for today, with the wild warriors of the berserkers. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please subscribe and give a thumbs up. See you soon, your channel History Best.